25 banned films that almost destroyed Golden Age Hollywood. Did you know that some of Hollywood's most powerful studios were nearly bankrupted by films you've probably never seen, masterpieces locked away in vaults, controversial pictures pulled from theaters after just days, and provocative movies that sent careers into freefall? While we celebrate the glamour of Golden Age Hollywood, there exists a shadow history of banned, censored, and suppressed films that nearly toppled the entire industry. These weren't just controversial movies, they were existential threats that forced studio executives to destroy their own creations and filmmakers to abandon their artistic visions. The story of these 25 banned films reveals Hollywood's greatest fear, that the freedom to create could destroy the very system that made that creation possible. But here's what makes this forgotten chapter of film history truly shocking. Many of these dangerous films weren't banned for the reasons you might expect. While some indeed pushed boundaries of taste and morality, others threatened powerful political interests, exposed uncomfortable truths about American society, or simply arrived at precisely the wrong historical moment. And perhaps most surprising of all, the greatest threat to creative freedom in Hollywood didn't come from conservative religious groups or government censors. It came from within the industry itself. The same studio heads who commissioned these boundary-pushing films were often the ones who ultimately buried them, sacrificing artistic expression on the altar of financial survival. What they couldn't have anticipated was how these suppressed works would eventually resurface, revealing a golden age of Hollywood far more complex, mature, and provocative than most people realize. So what happens when we uncover these forbidden films and the stories behind their suppression? Let's explore 25 banned movies that almost destroyed Golden Age Hollywood and discover what they reveal about the fragile balance between art, commerce, and power that still shapes the entertainment industry today. 1. The Miracle, 1948, the film that reached the Supreme Court. Roberto Rossellini's short film, The Miracle, starred Anna Magnani as a mentally challenged peasant woman who believes a wandering stranger, played by Federico Fellini, is Saint Joseph. After he gives her wine and takes advantage of her innocence, she becomes pregnant and believes it's an immaculate conception. When the film was imported to America in 1950 as part of an anthology called Ways of Love, the Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as sacrilegious. Cardinal Spellman of New York personally denounced the film from the pulpit of St. Patrick's Cathedral, calling it a desecration of Christian concepts. Protesters picketed theaters, and the New York State Board of Regents revoked the film's exhibition license, effectively banning it. The distributor, Joseph Burston, took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, resulting in the landmark 1952 decision Burston v. Wilson. The court unanimously ruled that motion pictures were a form of artistic expression protected by the First Amendment, and that the New York law permitting censorship of sacrilegious content was unconstitutional. What makes this case so significant is that it marked the beginning of the end for government censorship of films. Prior to this ruling, movies had been considered mere entertainment without First Amendment protection. The controversy around The Miracle fundamentally changed American film regulation and set the stage for more artistic freedom. However, in the short term, it made Hollywood studios extremely cautious about religious content, fearing similar backlash. 2. Freaks, 1932, the film that ended a director's career. Todd Browning had just directed Dracula with Bela Lugosi, one of Universal's biggest hits, when MGM offered him the chance to make any film he wanted. He chose Freaks, a horror drama set in a circus featuring real sideshow performers with various physical differences. Rather than mocking these individuals, Browning's film portrayed them sympathetically, while the normal characters were shown as cruel and manipulative. Test audiences reacted with horror, not at the film's message, but at the sight of real people with conditions like microcephaly, dwarfism, and missing limbs. One woman threatened to sue MGM, claiming the film had caused her to suffer a miscarriage. The studio panicked, cutting the film from 90 minutes to 64 minutes and adding a more upbeat ending. Even in its edited form, Freaks was banned in many states and countries, including the UK, where it remained prohibited for 30 years. MGM disowned the film, pulling it from distribution after its initial release and keeping it out of circulation until the 1960s. The studio even removed a Todd Browning production from the credits, effectively washing their hands of the entire project. The commercial failure and controversy surrounding Freaks destroyed Browning's career. Despite being one of Hollywood's most successful directors, he would direct only 4 more films before retiring in 1939. MGM, meanwhile, learned a harsh lesson about the limits of public tolerance, becoming much more conservative in its production choices. What's ironic is that Freaks is now considered a masterpiece masterpiece of compassionate filmmaking that was decades ahead of its time in humanizing people with physical differences. The film's famous line, one of us, has become part of popular culture, even as many people remain unaware of its source. 3. The Outlaw, 1943, the film that fought the censors for years. Howard Hughes spent a fortune producing this Western starring Jane Russell, focusing more on Russell's physique than the actual story of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. Hughes designed a special cantilever bra for Russell, which she later claimed she never wore, and filmed countless takes of scenes emphasizing her figure. The Hays office, which enforced the production code, demanded numerous cuts before granting the film a certificate. Hughes made some changes, but then did something unprecedented. He released the film for a brief run in 1943, then withdrew it and held private screenings while waging a 2-year battle with the censors. During this time, Hughes orchestrated one of the most provocative publicity campaigns in film history, with billboards asking, "What are the 2 great reasons for Jane Russell's rise to stardom?" accompanied by suggestive imagery. When the film finally received a general release in 1946, the controversy had created such enormous interest that it became a major box office success despite mediocre reviews. The significance of The Outlaw lies not in its artistic merit, but in Hughes' willingness to challenge the Production Code Administration directly. He essentially created a blueprint for how producers could use controversy and censorship battles as publicity tools, a strategy that would be employed repeatedly in the following decades. The film demonstrated that sexuality could be marketed to mainstream audiences despite official disapproval, weakening the code's authority years before its eventual collapse. 4th, Salt of the Earth, 1954. The Blacklisted Film. This independent labor drama about Mexican-American zinc miners in New Mexico and their fight for equality was perhaps the most thoroughly suppressed film in American history. Its crime? Being made by blacklisted Hollywood talent during the height of the Red Scare. The film's director, Herbert Biberman, writer, Michael Wilson, and producer, Paul Jericho, had all been blacklisted during the House Un-American Activities Committee investigations into alleged communist influence in Hollywood. Unable to work within the studio system, they formed an independent company to make Salt of the Earth, collaborating with the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, a union that had been expelled from the CIO for supposed communist leanings. The production faced extraordinary obstacles. The Hollywood Reporter denounced it as a commie production. Howard Hughes, then owner of RKO, used his influence to ensure that major studios wouldn't provide access to facilities or equipment. The FBI monitored the production. Local vigilantes threatened the crew and fired shots at the set. The film's star, Mexican actress Rosaura Revueltas, was arrested and deported before filming completed. When Salt of the Earth was finally completed, exhibitors refused to show it after projectionists, members of the staunchly anti-communist IATSE union, wouldn't run the film. It played in only 13 theaters nationwide, despite receiving positive reviews internationally. The film was effectively erased from American cinema history until the 1960s. What makes Salt of the Earth remarkable beyond its troubled production is its progressive content. The film depicts women taking leadership roles in the strike, examines ethnic discrimination against Mexican Americans, and portrays labor disputes with nuance rarely seen in Hollywood productions. Modern critics consider it a landmark of political and feminist cinema that was decades ahead of its time. 5. The Birth of a Nation, 1915. The controversial landmark. D.W. Griffith's epic about the Civil War and Reconstruction period was groundbreaking in its technical achievements and storytelling techniques, but horrifically racist in its depiction of Black Americans and its glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. While not a Golden Age film, typically considered to begin in the 1920s, its controversy and impact reverberated throughout Hollywood's classic period. Upon its release, the NAACP launched protests against the film's racist imagery and historical distortions. Riots broke out in several cities, and at least 3 people lost their lives in violence connected to the film. Multiple states and cities banned or censored The Birth of a Nation, including Chicago, Pittsburgh, and the entire state of Ohio. These bans created the first major film censorship battle in America. Griffith, who felt persecuted, became a vocal advocate for free expression in cinema. The controversy contributed directly to the establishment of the Supreme Court's Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio decision in 1915, which ruled that movies were not protected as free speech, a precedent that wouldn't be overturned until the Miracle case mentioned earlier. The film's commercial success, despite, or perhaps partly because of, the controversy, convinced Hollywood of both the profit potential in controversial content and the need for self-regulation to avoid government intervention. This directly led to the creation of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA, under Will Hays in 1922, which would evolve into the system that governed Hollywood content for decades. The Birth of a Nation remains perhaps the most difficult film in American cinema history, technically innovative and historically significant, while being morally reprehensible in its content. Its legacy includes both advancing film as an art form and inspiring a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The controversy surrounding it established patterns of protest, censorship, and industry response that would characterize many of the banned films that followed. 6. Ecstasy, 1933. The nude scene that shocked the world. This Czechoslovakian film starring Hedy Lamarr, then Hedy Kiesler, featured the first non-pornographic depiction of a female experiencing pleasure in cinema history, along with brief nudity as Lamarr swims in a lake. While tame by modern standards, Ecstasy created an international scandal that nearly ended Lamarr's career before it properly began. When the film was submitted for U.S. release, customs officials seized and banned it as obscene material. Various edited versions eventually received limited distribution, but the controversy followed Lamarr to Hollywood, where studios initially refused to hire her despite her beauty and talent. Lamarr's husband at the time, Austrian munitions manufacturer Fritz Mandl, was so outraged by the film that he attempted to buy up and destroy every copy in existence. His efforts failed, but the notoriety around Ecstasy haunted Lamarr throughout her career. Studio publicity departments simultaneously exploited her scandalous past while forcing her to maintain a respectable public image. MGM eventually signed Lamarr, but worked to reshape her image entirely, casting her in dignified roles and promoting her as a serious actress rather than the free-spirited performer from Ecstasy. This pattern of European actresses being rehabilitated for American audiences by controlling their image and suppressing their more provocative foreign films became standard practice in Golden Age Hollywood. The irony is that while Hollywood was busy restricting Lamarr's sexuality on screen, they completely overlooked her brilliant mind. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency hopping system that later became foundational to Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and cellular technology, a contribution far more significant than her momentary nudity in Ecstasy. 7. The North Star, 1943. From patriotic to problematic overnight. This MGM drama about Ukrainian villagers resisting Nazi occupation was produced with full studio backing and a star-studded cast, including Ann Baxter, Dana Andrews, and Walter Houston. Written by Lillian Hellman and directed by Louis Milestone, The North Star received 4 Academy Award nominations upon its release. What makes this film remarkable is how quickly it transformed from government-approved patriotic entertainment to suspected communist propaganda. During World War II, Hollywood was encouraged to create sympathetic portrayals of the Soviet Union, America's ally against Nazi Germany. The North Star was made with this explicit purpose, depicting brave Soviet citizens fighting against German invaders. After the war, as relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, the House Un-American Activities Committee began investigating Hollywood for communist influence. The North Star suddenly became evidence of pro-Soviet sentiment in the film industry. Hellman and Milestone were both called before HUAC, and the film was cited as an example of communist infiltration in Hollywood. In 1957, the film was re-edited, removing all positive references to the Soviet system, and re-released under the title Armored Attack. This censored version eliminated approximately 25 minutes of the original film, transforming it from a story about heroic Soviet resistance to a generic war film focused only on Nazi atrocities. The North Star demonstrates how political winds could retroactively transform a mainstream studio film into forbidden content. Actors and filmmakers who had proudly participated in what was considered patriotic filmmaking during the war found their careers threatened by those same projects just a few years later. This whiplash effect created a climate of fear in Hollywood that directly contributed to the blacklist era and increased self-censorship. 8. Scarface, 1932. The gangster film that went too far. Howard Hawks' gangster film loosely based on Al Capone's life was so violent and controversial that it faced rejection from the Hays office despite being produced before strict production code enforcement began. Producer Howard Hughes battled censors for over a year, making changes but refusing to completely dilute the film's impact. What made Scarface particularly problematic for censors was its unflinching portrayal of gangster life, including implied incestuous undertones between the protagonist Tony Camonte, Paul Mooney, and his sister Cheska and Dvorak. The film's innovative use of visual metaphors for violence, such as a bowling pin falling when someone is murdered, actually made its impact more disturbing rather than less. Several states refused to grant the film an exhibition license, even after Hughes added a new ending where Camonte dies as a coward rather than fighting to the last bullet, as in the original cut. Hughes eventually added a prologue condemning gangster life and changed the title to Scarface: The Shame of a Nation, but these modifications couldn't disguise the film's raw power. The controversy surrounding Scarface directly influenced the stricter enforcement of the production code that began in 1934. The film demonstrated that talented filmmakers could convey violence and immoral behavior even while technically adhering to content restrictions. In response, Joseph Breen's administration of the code became much more focused on the spirit of films rather than just specific content, leading to more comprehensive censorship. After its initial release, Scarface was essentially suppressed for decades, unavailable for television broadcast or theatrical re-release until the 1970s. This suppression helped create a blueprint for how controversial films would be handled throughout the Golden Age, allowed a brief release to recoup costs, then quietly removed from circulation to avoid ongoing controversy. 9. The Well of Loneliness, the film that never was. This entry is unique because the film was never actually made, and that's precisely why it's significant. Radcliffe Hall's 1928 novel about lesbian relationships was a landmark of LGBTQ literature that faced obscenity trials in Britain. Despite controversy, the book sold well, prompting Hollywood interest in a film adaptation. Multiple studios quietly explored acquiring rights to the novel in the late 1920s and early 1930s, seeing potential in its romantic storyline and literary pedigree. However, as word spread about these potential adaptations, religious groups mobilized against them. The Catholic Legion of Decency explicitly warned that any attempt to film The Well of Loneliness would result in a nationwide boycott of the producing studio. The threat was taken seriously. By 1934, when production code enforcement became strict, The Well of Loneliness was placed on an unofficial, unadaptable list, books that could never be filmed regardless of how they might be modified. This preemptive censorship established a pattern that would affect countless LGBTQ-themed properties throughout the Golden Age. What makes this non-film significant is how it demonstrates the power of threatened censorship. The mere possibility of controversy was enough to prevent studios from pursuing potentially valuable literary properties. This chilling effect extended far beyond explicit content to themes, subtexts, and even the personal lives of those involved in filmmaking. The unmade adaptation of The Well of Loneliness represents countless stories that were never told on screen during Hollywood's Golden Age because of anticipatory self-censorship. 10. Blockade, 1938, the Spanish Civil War film that pleased no one. Walter Wanger produced this drama starring Henry Fonda as a Spanish farmer caught up in the country's civil war. The film attempted to address the conflict without explicitly taking sides, but even this cautious approach proved too controversial for 1938 America. Blockade never mentions fascists, loyalists, Republicans, or nationalists by name. The film focuses on civilian suffering caused by a naval blockade preventing food from reaching starving people. Yet despite these efforts at neutrality, Catholic groups condemned the film as pro-loyalist and therefore pro-communist propaganda. Theater owners faced picket lines, and the film performed poorly at the box office. Ironically, those sympathetic to the Spanish Republic criticized the film for being too timid and obscuring the real political issues of the conflict. By trying to please everyone, Blockade ended up pleasing no one, and taught Hollywood a painful lesson about addressing ongoing political conflicts, even obliquely. The film's failure had lasting consequences. Throughout World War II and the Cold War, studios became extremely reluctant to address contemporary political issues in their fictional films, particularly civil conflicts where American opinion was divided. When they did tackle such topics, they typically waited until a clear consensus had emerged about who were the heroes and villains, as with anti-Nazi films that only became common after America entered World War II. Blockade remains significant as one of the only Hollywood studio films to address the Spanish Civil War in any form while it was still ongoing. Its commercial failure and the controversy it generated effectively closed off contemporary political conflicts as viable subject matter for mainstream Hollywood films for decades to come. 11th, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, 1932, the film that changed laws. This Warner Brothers drama based on Robert E. Burns' memoir exposed the brutal conditions in Southern prison chain gangs. Paul Mooney starred as James Allen, a wrongfully convicted man who escapes twice from a sadistic penal system. The film's unforgettable final scene, with Allen disappearing into darkness while whispering, "I steal," indicted a justice system that transformed a decent man into a criminal. The state of Georgia, whose penal system was clearly the basis for the film's setting, was outraged. Officials threatened Warner Brothers with lawsuits and attempted to ban the film. Theater owners in Georgia and other southern states faced intense pressure not to show it. Burns himself, who was still a fugitive living under an assumed name when the film was released, faced renewed pursuit from Georgia authorities angered by the negative publicity. Despite these challenges, I Am a Fugitive was both a critical and commercial success. Its unflinching portrayal of injustice galvanized public opinion against chain gang systems. Within 2 years of the film's release, Georgia abolished chain gangs, demonstrating cinema's potential to drive real-world reform. The controversy surrounding the film made studio executives nervous about tackling similar social justice themes, even as its success proved audiences would embrace such content. This tension between commercial potential and political risk characterized Hollywood's approach to social problem films throughout the Golden Age. For every gentleman's agreement or Crossfire that successfully addressed discrimination, dozens of similarly themed projects were abandoned due to fear of regional boycotts or political backlash. 12th, The President Vanishes, 1934, the film that predicted fascism in America. This political thriller, directed by William Wellman, imagined a scenario where a U.S. president fakes his own kidnapping to prevent powerful interests from pushing America into a European war. The film explicitly portrayed American business leaders collaborating with a fascist militia called the Gray Shirts, clearly modeled on Nazi brown shirts, to manipulate public opinion. Released just as the production code began strict enforcement, The President Vanishes managed to squeak through before political content came under intense scrutiny. The film's frank portrayal of corruption among American business elites and its suggestion that fascist movements could gain traction in the United States proved too controversial for sustained distribution. After its initial release, Paramount effectively suppressed the film, keeping it out of circulation. When the Senate's Nye Committee began investigating propaganda in Hollywood the following year, The President Vanishes was cited as evidence of the film industry's potential to influence public opinion on war and peace. This attention made studios even more cautious about politically charged content. What makes this film particularly notable is how accurately it predicted the rise of American fascist movements like the German-American Bund, which wouldn't reach their peak until several years after the film's release. Its suggestion that wealthy industrialists might support such movements for their own profit aligned with later revelations about business leaders like Henry Ford, who expressed admiration for fascist policies. The President Vanishes established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Golden Age. Politically prescient films often faced suppression precisely because their uncomfortable truths threatened powerful interests. The film's virtual disappearance from circulation demonstrates how effectively Hollywood could memory hole content that struck too close to home. 13. Titanic, 1943, the Nazi propaganda film that became a Hollywood cautionary tale. This German production, commissioned by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, portrayed the Titanic disaster as the result of British and American capitalist greed. The film depicted fictional German officers warning of danger, while British officers pushed for speed to increase company profits and passenger comfort. What makes this film relevant to Hollywood history is what happened after World War II. As American studios gained control of former UFA film assets, Titanic presented a dilemma. The film featured impressive special effects and dramatic scenes of the sinking that could potentially be repurposed. However, its obvious propaganda elements made it radioactive in the post-war environment. Hollywood executives studying the film were disturbed by how effectively entertainment techniques could be used for propaganda purposes. The film's director, Herbert Selpin, had been arrested during production after complaining about Kriegsmarine officers interfering with filming. He was found hanged in his cell the next day, a stark reminder of the dangers of mixing filmmaking with politics. Titanic became a case study within the industry of how easily historical drama could be manipulated for political purposes. The film influenced Hollywood's cautious approach to historical subjects during the Cold War, with studios preferring safely distant time periods or apolitical approaches to recent history. When American studios eventually tackled the Titanic disaster themselves in 1953's Titanic with Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb, they focused entirely on fictional personal dramas rather than systemic criticism. The Nazi Titanic remains largely unseen in America to this day, accessible primarily to scholars and historians. Its existence served as a warning to Golden Age Hollywood about the thin line between historical drama and propaganda, a warning that encouraged political caution in historical filmmaking. 14. Rope of Sand, 1949, the film that exposed Hollywood's diamond secrets. This Paramount noir thriller starring Burt Lancaster and Claude Rains was set in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, and depicted corruption in the diamond industry, including the artificially inflated prices maintained by the De Beers cartel. While not as explicitly banned as some films on this list, Rope of Sand faced extraordinary behind-the-scenes pressure that altered its content and limited its distribution. The De Beers Diamond Cartel, concerned about the film's portrayal of their business practices, used their considerable influence to pressure Paramount. The studio was forced to add a disclaimer stating the film was entirely fictional and bore no resemblance to any actual diamond company. More significantly, Paramount agreed to limit the film's international distribution, particularly in markets where De Beers had significant operations. Beyond these direct interventions, Rope of Sand demonstrated how corporate interests could influence Hollywood content more broadly. After the controversy, major studios became extremely cautious about portraying actual industries in a negative light, particularly those with concentrated power and international reach. Films critical of business practices were either set safely in the past, like Citizen Kane, or focused on fictional companies and generic industries. This corporate censorship operated differently from government or religious pressure, but was equally effective at limiting what stories could be told. Rope of Sand established an unwritten rule in Hollywood. Powerful industries were off-limits for criticism unless heavily fictionalized. This rule would remain largely in effect until the 1970s, when films like The China Syndrome again dared to challenge corporate interests directly. 15. The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, 1944. Preston Sturges tricks the censors. This Preston Sturges comedy somehow managed to center its plot around an unmarried pregnancy and get away with it during the height of production code enforcement. The film stars Betty Hutton as Trudy Cockenlocker, who discovers she's pregnant after a wild night with a soldier she can't remember, having possibly married him while intoxicated. The genius of Sturgis's approach was creating a film so farcical and seemingly innocent in its presentation that censors missed or pretended to miss its fundamentally scandalous premise. The Production Code Administration was so focused on specific words and images that they failed to object to the core narrative, an unmarried woman trying to find a husband to provide legitimacy for her child. When the film was released and its true nature became apparent, religious groups were outraged. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the film, and numerous local censorship boards demanded cuts or outright banned it. Paramount found itself defending a film that should never have passed code scrutiny in the first place. The Miracle of Morgan's Creek is significant because it revealed the limitations of content-based censorship systems. By following the letter of the code while violating its spirit, Sturges demonstrated how creative filmmakers could subvert censorship through implication and euphemism. The film's success, it was one of Paramount's highest-grossing releases of 1944, proved audiences were ready for more mature content than the code allowed. The controversy surrounding the film led to stricter script scrutiny, with censors paying more attention to underlying themes rather than just specific content. This adaptation made it even harder for filmmakers to address adult subjects, closing the loophole Sturges had so brilliantly exploited. As we've seen, banned and controversial films faced obstacles from various directions: government censors, religious organizations, corporate interests, and the industry's own self-regulatory bodies. But these challenges were about to intensify dramatically as the Cold War and Red Scare transformed Hollywood's relationship with political content. 16. Mission to Moscow, 1943, the film that launched a congressional investigation. Warner Brothers produced this overtly pro-Soviet film at the direct request of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who wanted to build public support for America's wartime alliance with the USSR. Based on the memoirs of former U.S. Ambassador Joseph E. Davies, the film portrayed Soviet leader Joseph Stalin sympathetically and defended the controversial Moscow trials, where Stalin purged his political rivals. During World War II, Mission to Moscow received full studio backing and government support. However, after the war, as U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated, the film became a lightning rod for accusations of communist influence in Hollywood. Jack Warner was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he was forced to defend his studio's decision to make the film. Warner saved himself by essentially throwing the film's screenwriter Howard Koch under the bus, suggesting Koch had inserted pro-communist propaganda into the script. Koch was subsequently blacklisted, his career destroyed by a film that had been made with explicit government approval. Mission to Moscow was withdrawn from circulation and suppressed by Warner Brothers, who were eager to demonstrate their patriotism in the new Cold War environment. The film became essentially unavailable until the 1970s, illustrating how quickly political shifts could transform prestigious projects into toxic liabilities. This case is particularly significant because it demonstrated that even having government approval for controversial content provided no protection when political winds shifted. The film's suppression sent a clear message to Hollywood. Any content that might be considered politically problematic in the future represented an unacceptable risk, regardless of current approval. 17. Strange Victory, 1948. The documentary that exposed American racism. This independent documentary, directed by Leo Hurwitz, examined the paradox of America defeating Nazism abroad while maintaining systemic racism at home. Using powerful juxtapositions of Nazi propaganda and American segregation, the film argued that many of the same prejudices Hitler exploited existed within American society. Major distributors refused to handle Strange Victory, and few theaters would show it. The film's producers faced accusations of communist sympathies for daring to critique American race relations during the early Cold War, when any criticism of American society was increasingly viewed as unpatriotic. What makes Strange Victory particularly significant is how it demonstrates the intensified suppression of racial justice content during the Red Scare. As civil rights activism became falsely associated with communist influence, Hollywood became increasingly reluctant to address racial inequality. This chilling effect would delay meaningful Hollywood engagement with civil rights issues until the late 1950s and early 1960s. The film's suppression illustrates how political censorship and racial censorship reinforced each other in Golden Age Hollywood. By labeling civil rights advocacy as potentially subversive, those who benefited from maintaining racial hierarchies could effectively silence criticism of the status quo. Strange Victory thus represents countless stories about racial injustice that went untold on American screens during this period. 18. The Prowler, 1951, film noir that crossed the line. This Joseph Losey-directed noir starred Van Heflin as a corrupt police officer who has an affair with a married woman, Evelyn Keyes, and plots to kill her husband. What distinguished The Prowler from other noir films was its unflinching portrayal of police corruption and its morally ambiguous ending, where the protagonist faces consequences but not complete justice. The film's negative portrayal of law enforcement triggered opposition from police organizations and conservative groups. Various state and local censorship boards demanded cuts, particularly to scenes suggesting police would cover up crimes committed by fellow officers. Some theaters refused to show the film entirely, fearing community backlash. The Prowler arrived at a particularly dangerous moment for its creators. Director Joseph Losey was under investigation by HUAC and would be blacklisted and forced into European exile shortly after the film's release. Producer Sam Spiegel, working under the name S.P. Eagle, was also under political scrutiny. The film's writer, Hugo Butler, was already blacklisted and worked on the script uncredited. The controversy surrounding The Prowler contributed to a broader Hollywood reluctance to portray authority figures, particularly police, military, and government officials, in a negative light during the 1950s. This self-censorship would last until the late 1960s and early 1970s, when films like Serpico and The Conversation again dared to question institutional authority. 19. Kiss Me Deadly, 1955. Nuclear noir that went too far. Robert Aldrich directed this adaptation of Mickey Spillane's detective novel, transforming it into an apocalyptic noir about the nuclear age. The film follows Detective Mike Hammer as he investigates a case involving a mysterious glowing box that ultimately contains radioactive material that explodes in the film's nihilistic ending. The Atomic Energy Commission expressed serious concerns about the film's portrayal of nuclear material as potentially accessible to criminals and its graphic depiction of nuclear destruction. Various censorship boards demanded cuts to the explosion sequence, while others objected to the film's violence and sexual content. What makes Kiss Me Deadly particularly significant is how it challenged the era's enforced optimism about nuclear power. During the 1950s, the U.S. government was actively promoting atoms for peace and attempting to reduce public anxiety about nuclear technology. A film suggesting nuclear materials could fall into criminal hands directly contradicted these reassurance efforts. The film's controversial ending, where opening the radioactive box leads to apocalyptic destruction, was literally cut from many prints. An alternative ending showing characters escaping was substituted in some markets. This physical alteration of the film represented a direct intervention to make its political message less disturbing. Kiss Me Deadly eventually gained recognition as a masterpiece of film noir, but its initial reception and censorship battles demonstrate how political concerns could shape content even in genres not typically seen as political. The film's suppression helped establish unwritten rules about how nuclear weapons and radiation could be portrayed in Hollywood cinema. 20. The Blackboard Jungle, 1955, the film that made rock and roll dangerous. This drama about an inner-city school, starring Glenn Ford as an idealistic teacher facing rebellious students, became controversial less for its plot than for its use of Bill Haley and his Comets' Rock Around the Clock over the opening credits, the first use of rock music in a major Hollywood film. The inclusion of rock and roll music, already controversial for its associations with youth rebellion and racial integration, triggered unexpected reactions. When the film was shown at the Venice Film Festival, the American ambassador to Italy demanded its withdrawal, claiming it portrayed American youth in a negative light. In the U.S., numerous school boards condemned the film as promoting juvenile delinquency. Theaters showing The Blackboard Jungle reported incidents of vandalism and disruptive behavior, with teenagers dancing in the aisles during the opening credits or returning repeatedly just to hear the song. Several cities imposed age restrictions on the film, effectively treating it as adults-only content despite its educational setting. Claire Booth Luce, the American ambassador to Italy, walked out of the Venice screening in protest, creating a diplomatic incident. MGM was pressured to withdraw the film from international distribution to avoid further damaging America's image abroad, though the studio ultimately resisted this pressure. The Blackboard Jungle exemplifies how seemingly minor creative choices, like the selection of a soundtrack, could trigger censorship mechanisms designed for much more explicit content. The film's reception established rock music as inherently controversial in Hollywood, influencing how youth culture would be portrayed on screen for the next decade. 21. Paths of Glory, 1957, the anti-war film that offended an ally. Stanley Kubrick directed this powerful anti-war film starring Kirk Douglas as a French officer defending soldiers against charges of cowardice during World War I. The film's unflinching portrayal of military injustice and the futility of war made it controversial even before release. While United Artists proceeded with American distribution, the film faced an effective ban in France and several other European countries. The French government considered the film's portrayal of French military leadership as cruel and incompetent to be deeply offensive. Through diplomatic channels, they made their displeasure known to Hollywood, creating pressure against international distribution. The film wasn't officially shown in France until 1975, 18 years after its production. This extraordinary suppression of a major American film in an allied nation demonstrated the international political pressures facing Hollywood studios. The film's limited European distribution significantly impacted its commercial performance and cultural impact. Paths of Glory established a pattern that would affect many controversial films of the era. American studios would release challenging content domestically, but cooperate with suppression efforts internationally to maintain good relationships with foreign governments. This dual approach allowed Hollywood to claim artistic freedom at home while practicing de facto censorship abroad. The controversy surrounding the film influenced how Hollywood portrayed historical wars, particularly those involving American allies. Throughout the remainder of the Golden Age, studios typically avoided depicting Allied military leadership in World War I or II in a negative light, regardless of historical accuracy. 22. Baby Doll, 1956, the film that enraged the Catholic Church. Elia Kazan directed this Tennessee Williams adaptation starring Carol Baker as a childlike bride whose much older husband, Carl Malden, has agreed to wait until her 20th birthday to consummate their marriage. Meanwhile, a business rival, Eli Wallach, attempts to seduce her to gain revenge on her husband. The film's suggestive marketing, featuring Baker in a crib sucking her thumb, combined with its themes of delayed consummation and seduction, triggered an unprecedented response from the Catholic Legion of Decency. Cardinal Spencer Spellman personally condemned the film from the pulpit of St. Patrick's Cathedral, calling it revolting and declaring it a sin for Catholics to view it. Despite passing production code review with demanded modifications, Baby Doll faced a nationwide Catholic boycott. Many theaters, particularly in heavily Catholic areas, refused to show the film. Warner Brothers struggled to book the film in major chains, and its box office performance suffered dramatically despite positive reviews. Time magazine called the controversy the hottest Catholic Protestant issue since the presidential campaign of Al Smith. The film's reception highlighted the extraordinary power religious groups still held over film distribution, even as the production code's influence was beginning to wane. Baby Doll became a cautionary tale within Hollywood about the risks of sexual content that relied on suggestion rather than explicit portrayal. The film demonstrated that implication could be more controversial than direct representation because it engaged the audience's imagination. This lesson influenced how sexuality would be approached in Hollywood films for years to come. 23rd. The Moon is Blue. 1953, the comedy that broke the code. Otto Preminger directed this light comedy about a young woman, Maggie McNamara, who frankly discusses topics like virginity and seduction with two men interested in her. The film's controversy stemmed not from any explicit content, but from its use of forbidden words like virgin, seduce, and pregnant, along with its generally casual attitude towards sexual matters. When the Production Code Administration refused to grant the film a seal of approval, United Artists made the unprecedented decision to release it anyway. The first major studio film distributed without code approval since enforcement became strict in 1934. The gamble paid off. The Moon is Blue became a box office success despite being condemned by the Legion of Decency and banned in several cities. The film's commercial viability without code approval demonstrated that the self-censorship system was losing its power to regulate content. The following year, Howard Hughes would similarly release The French Line without code approval, further weakening the system. The Moon is Blue marks a crucial turning point in Hollywood censorship. Its success proved audiences were ready for more adult content than the code allowed, beginning a process of liberalization that would eventually lead to the code's replacement by the MPAA rating system in 1968. The film's legacy isn't in its artistic achievement, but in its role as the first successful challenge to a system that had restricted Hollywood content for 2 decades. 24. Sunrise at Campobello, 1960, the film that hid a president's disability. This biographical drama starring Ralph Bellamy as Franklin D. Roosevelt focuses on Roosevelt's struggle with polio and his return to political life. While not banned in the conventional sense, the film perpetuated one of the most successful acts of mass media censorship in American history, the concealment of the full extent of Roosevelt's paralysis from the public. Throughout Roosevelt's presidency, there had been a gentleman's agreement among news photographers not to show the president in his wheelchair or being carried. This voluntary censorship kept most Americans unaware of the severity of Roosevelt's disability. Sunrise at Campobello continued this tradition, showing Roosevelt walking with braces and canes, something he could do only for short, painful distances on ceremonial occasions. The film faced behind-the-scenes pressure to maintain this sanitized portrayal. The Roosevelt family, protective of FDR's legacy, exercised script approval rights. Warner Brothers, concerned about potential controversy, supported a version of events that showed Roosevelt triumphantly walking rather than accepting his wheelchair use. What makes this case significant is how it demonstrates self-censorship extending beyond moral or political content to historical accuracy. Even after Roosevelt's death, Hollywood continued to participate in concealing the reality of his disability, perpetuating the myth that determination alone had allowed him to overcome physical limitations. This sanitized portrayal had real consequences for Americans with disabilities, who were denied a powerful role model of a wheelchair user who had reached the highest office in the land. Sunrise at Campobello thus represents a form of representation censorship that erased disability from American leadership history. 25. High Noon, 1952, the Western that became a political battleground. Fred Zinnemann directed this Western starring Gary Cooper as a marshal who must face a returning criminal gang alone when the townspeople refuse to help him. Written by Carl Foreman, who was under investigation by HUAC during production, the film was widely interpreted as an allegory about Hollywood's failure to stay stand up to McCarthyism. While High Noon was commercially successful and critically acclaimed, winning 4 Academy Awards including Best Actor for Cooper, it became entangled in Cold War politics. Howard Hawks and John Wayne were so offended by the film's perceived attack on American values that they made Rio Bravo as a direct response. Wayne called High Noon the most un-American thing I've ever seen in my whole life. Foreman was blacklisted before the film's completion and had to leave the country after its release. Producer Stanley Kramer faced industry backlash for working with him. Despite the film's success, its political subtext made it controversial in Hollywood circles and nearly destroyed the careers of those associated with it. High Noon demonstrates how even mainstream, commercially successful films could become battlegrounds in the ideological conflicts of the era. The film wasn't banned outright, but the professional consequences for its creators illustrate how political censorship operated in Hollywood, not through direct suppression of content, but through the blacklisting of those who created it. The film's reception also reveals the power of allegorical storytelling to evade explicit censorship. By encoding political commentary within a traditional Western narrative, Foreman managed to create an enduring critique of political cowardice that continues to resonate decades after the specific events that inspired it. Now here's what few people realize about Hollywood's banned films. The censorship system that suppressed them wasn't primarily designed to protect public morality, it was created to protect studio profits. When the production code was established in 1930 and strictly enforced from 1934 onward, it wasn't because studio heads suddenly developed moral qualms about their content. It was because they feared government regulation would be worse for business than self-censorship. The real driving force behind Hollywood censorship was the studio system itself, a vertically integrated monopoly where major studios controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. This enormously profitable arrangement depended on maintaining respectability and avoiding government scrutiny. Controversial films that might trigger calls for regulation threatened not just individual movies, but the entire business model. This explains why studios sometimes invested in producing controversial films only to suppress them later. The initial investment represented creative ambition and the pursuit of artistic distinction. The subsequent suppression represented the triumph of business interests over artistic expression. Studio heads weren't moral guardians, they were pragmatic businessmen protecting their monopolistic industry from outside interference. Understanding this dynamic changes how we should view these banned films. They weren't just victims of prudish social attitudes, they were casualties of an industry structure that prioritized stability over artistic freedom. The same studios that created groundbreaking, boundary-pushing content were ultimately responsible for burying it when it threatened their business interests. We began by asking what happens when we uncover Hollywood's forbidden films and the stories behind their suppression. What we've discovered is that these banned movies reveal a fundamental tension at the heart of the studio system, between the creative impulse to explore challenging subjects and the commercial imperative to maintain a profitable, scandal-free business. The 25 films we've examined represent just a fraction of the content suppressed during Hollywood's golden age. For every controversial film that was completed and subsequently banned, dozens more were abandoned at the script stage or modified beyond recognition to avoid potential problems. This preemptive censorship may represent an even greater creative loss than the suppression of completed films. Yet there's an encouraging aspect to this history as well. Many of these banned films have been rediscovered and restored in recent decades. Freaks has transformed from a suppressed curiosity to a celebrated classic. Salt of the Earth is now recognized as a landmark of independent political cinema. Even The Outlaw, originally notorious solely for Jane Russell's physique, has been reassessed for its significance in challenging censorship. These resurrections remind us that suppression is rarely permanent. The same controversial elements that once made these films dangerous often make them valuable historical documents today. They provide windows into aspects of American society that mainstream film production sought to ignore or sanitize. As we continue to uncover and reevaluate Hollywood's banned films, we gain a more complete understanding of both cinema history and American cultural development. These forbidden movies reveal not just what was shown on screen during the Golden Age, but what wasn't allowed to be shown. And those absences often tell us more about the era's anxieties and power structures than its celebrated classics ever could. If you enjoyed this exploration of Hollywood's banned films, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more content delving into the fascinating hidden histories of classic cinema. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about which of these banned films you'd most like to see, or if you know of other suppressed classics we should cover in future videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next journey through the forgotten corners of Hollywood history.